All right, welcome everyone. My name is Julie Peterson, and I am a public historian and exhibit developer at the History Colorado Center in Denver. I'm really excited to be gathered here today with you and some of my colleagues from History Colorado and one of our community partners. So before we get started, I'm just going to have my fellow panelists just quickly introduce themselves, and we'll start with Eric.
So good morning, everyone, or afternoon for some of you, I'm sure. My name is Eric Carpio. I'm the Chief Community Museum Officer at History Colorado. I also serve as the director of the Fort Garland Museum and Cultural Center, and we'll talk a little bit more about that space later this morning. We're located in the southern part of Colorado, in south central Colorado. Welcome, thank you.
And Alejandra?
Hi, I'm Alejandra. I am the education coordinator here at Fort Garland and Culture Center, and I am the lead facilitator and curriculum creator for the Antonito Youth Memory Project.
And Maria.
Hi, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us. My name is Maria Islas Lopez. I am the Museum of Memory Manager at History Colorado. I oversee this statewide initiative that is taking place right now across three different community museums, well, two community museums in Colorado and the History Colorado Center.
And Lori.
Hello, everyone. My name is Lori Crawford, and I'm a community organizer with Antonito Together, and we are a equity group in Antonito, Colorado, in the southern part of Colorado.
Excellent. Thanks, everyone. So as I mentioned, I am an exhibit developer and public historian at the History Colorado Center in Denver. So I don't actually get to be involved directly with the Museum of Memory projects that Maria coordinates and that Eric and Alejandra and Lori have been working on. So really what we wanted to do today is kind of take my interest in how our museum can facilitate community-driven, memory-centered oral history work, and really take this opportunity for me to ask my colleagues all about this project so that all of you NCPHers can also learn about it and think about the lessons that have been learned. So just in some of the preliminary conversations I've had with Maria and Eric, particularly about this project, a couple of the themes that really have emerged are this idea of intergenerational storytelling, collaboration, excuse Pepita, the cat, collaboration across multiple stakeholders, and really this idea of thinking about how community development and well-being intersects with public history. So as you can see, there are so many layers to this project, and I really wanted to get us started by just learning about a couple of those layers. So we're going to start with hearing from Maria to tell us a little bit about kind of the framework of Museum of Memory. And I'm curious, Maria, if you can kind of share what is that framework? What are the key components of a Museum of Memory project?
Of course. So Museum of Memory is an initiative that is part of History Colorado's Department Equity and Engagement. And as you mentioned, Julie, this is a public history and community engaged program that creates opportunities for the least heard Colorado communities, and this meaning those communities that have been historically impacted by systems of oppression and inequality, to collaborate with each other and with History Colorado in exploring their past in their own terms, in deciding how they want to explore it and how they want to communicate this exploration to themselves and to others. So Museum of Memory draws on the framework of the Museums Without Walls and uses an of, by, and with community approach to guide our actions. So in this sense, Museum of Memory partners with community-based organizations like the one Lori represents here, schools, resident teams, and community members that are really interested in exploring and documenting their own collective past and narrating them in their own terms and from their own perspective. So all Museum of Memory projects are rooted in the initiative and the concern of the community to thinking about their own past and to communicate it to themselves. So typically, we engage with these community groups and these community members and these partners in a process that typically involve a stage of community engagement, a stage of collective remembering, and a stage of memory sharing workshops and storytelling that evolves into a process of sharing the outcomes of these memory projects with the community. And I'm going to share you a little bit, I'm going to share some pictures right now that can illustrate a little bit this process. So, for example, in participating communities, as we are engaging in partnerships with each other, and here it's one of our team members, the Chief of Equity and Engagement History at Colorado, Marisa Volpe at the center, with partners that we have with the Colorado State University to the right, and to the left with the Globeville, the Bruce Randolph School in Globeville here in Denver, Colorado. So the process engaged with participating communities, reaching out with connecting with them, then gathering to discuss the memories of their neighborhoods. And this gathering can take the form of a music performance in which we are what we call the Unplugged Memory Workshop, in which community members gather together to listen to music. This is one of the events that we had in Southern Colorado in the neighborhood of Dogpatch in Pueblo, Colorado. It can also look like getting together to share photos and to have conversations around photos, or perhaps to get together to discuss memories of their neighborhoods, drawing pictures of the childhood homes, and find the interconnecting points between these. It also involves the collecting efforts. And then the collecting efforts involve the collection of photos. We hold photo scanning days, but also the collection of oral histories that are community-led, meaning that we also provide training for community members to become community oral historians, and then they are the ones that make decisions about who they're going to be interviewing for oral histories, how they want to do this work, and how they're going to be processing this information. And this is a photo, for example, of one of the photo scanning days from our project in Avondale in Southern Colorado in Pueblo. So at the end of all Museum of Memory projects, at the end of this process of engaging, of collective remembering, of collecting of stories at the grassroots level, there is a process in which participants, we facilitate the sharing of the outcomes of these projects. And this could be done through a community event like this one, or through the creation of a mural or exhibits. This is, for example, a mural that was created by these muralists interpreting the oral histories and the significant themes and places and people of the oral histories that were collected by the resident team in the community of Salt Creek. So what is unique about Museum of Memory is that we have an emphasis on place-based collective remembering, that these collective histories are created in the process of bringing different voices in conversation as a means to document history from the ground up. And this is very place and site specific. And because we have a mechanism for donation of the products of these memory projects into History Colorado's permanent collection, these memory projects are also making sure that we are developing an archive in History Colorado that is including the many diverse stories of the communities that call Colorado home. And this also adds to questions of representations and ownership of the community of the historical record that we are helping to preserve and store. So in youth memory projects, the type of project we're going to be discussing today, this process is 100% led by youth. These projects involve writing and storytelling curriculum that is really training youth to become the community historians, and that is geared towards elevating their voices within the communities. And in the process of doing that, the youth are actively engaging in local history, in culture, and in heritage discovery as a way for them to create pathways for youth leadership, for social connections, civic engagement, and cultural healing, particularly because we're talking about youth from communities that have been underrepresented. And this is for these images from this youth project are particularly from the Bruce Randolph School Youth Memory Project that we held here in Denver a couple of years ago.
Thank you so much, Maria. I'm excited to dig further into this. But I'm curious, Eric, if you could introduce us specifically to the Antonito Youth Memory Project and kind of give us a sense of the community in which it took place.
Yeah, thanks, Julie, and thanks, Maria. As Julie said, I'm going to share a little bit just to kind of situate the program, share some information about Fort Garland, where our museum is at, but also Antonito, which is the community that is the focus of the project, and then also provide kind of a framework so you kind of get a sense of how this particular project unfolded. I may leave some gaps during the conversation. That's somewhat intentional because we want to dig in, through Alejandra and Lori and others' perspective, and then hear the questions that you have specifically. So it may seem like I run through this fairly quickly, but again, we hope to kind of dig in deeper into the areas of interest that this audience might be interested in exploring. So I'm going to share my screen here. So like I said, we're going to talk about the Antonito Youth Memory Project. And as I mentioned during my introduction, I play a couple different roles at History Colorado. One is I serve as the director of the Fort Garland Museum and Cultural Center in Fort Garland, Colorado. Fort Garland is located in a region of the state referred to as the San Luis Valley. The valley is, just so that you can kind of get a sense of where we're at geographically, we're in the south central part of Colorado, in the yellow space down there at the bottom of the map, just on the Colorado-New Mexico border. The two red stars that you see, the one more to the left is the community of Antonito, and then the one in Costilla County there to the right is where the museum is at in Fort Garland. We're about 40 miles away from the museum to Antonito, the community that we'll be talking about. Fort Garland is what we consider a community museum of History Colorado. So Julie mentioned the History Colorado Center in Denver, where she and Maria reside and where their offices are. That's kind of our headquarters, if you will. That's where our large flagship museum is at. But we also operate 7 other museums and historic sites around the state in communities. Many which are in rural communities, but they represent a wide range of different communities and geographies, cultures, backgrounds, and histories throughout the state. Fort Garland in particular is in a relatively rural space, again, in the San Luis Valley. And it's what we consider like a historic and culturally rich area with significant cultural and historic assets. Just to give you a sense of the history here, I'm joining from the historic homelands of the Capote and the Capote Band of the Ute peoples. I also, right out my window is Mount Blanca, otherwise known as Cisnangini, which is the easternmost sacred mountain of the Navajo people, or the Dinétah. And so this is really a historic area. Later this was also the northern edge of the Spanish frontier when Spanish explorers came into and through Santa Fe and northern New Mexico and into southern Colorado. That was part of that Spanish Empire until around 1821, when Mexico claimed their independence. So this became part of Mexico for another 27 years through 1848, after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, in which case this became, part of now the southwestern United States. And so there are peoples that live in this area who have family connections for generations back to, these contested histories. And so in a lot of ways, the project that we're talking about really, connects us to that history and helps to, work through some issues around identity and those kind of things, which we'll talk about here in a few. I'm going to shift a little bit now to this particular project. We've got 2 projects that we're fortunate to be running right now through our museum. One is with a community called San Luis, which is immediately to the south of us, and the other in Antonito, which is what we're going to be talking about here this morning. So our project partners are an organization, a local nonprofit called Antonito Together, which Lori represents. And just to give some background around the partnership and the way that these connections were made. So Antonito and San Luis, both of the communities that we're working with here, and then another community that Maria mentioned, the Avondale community in Pueblo, all three of those relationships came about through conversations we began having back in 2017 with an organization called the Colorado Trust. The Colorado Trust is a health equity foundation that really serves communities across the state that that have faced inequitable health outcomes in particular because of issues of oppression, and injustice, maybe environmental degradation, gentrification, and all of these kinds of issues. And so as we began meeting with local community and some of the resident teams here in the San Luis Valley and learning about their goals and interests, that were contributing to some of these health inequities, we made the connection between some of the projects that we had begun piloting at our Pueblo Museum, particularly our Museum Memory Project, but others as well. And so this photo that you see is a photo that was taken back, I believe, in late 2017, maybe early 2018, when we invited members of each of those resident teams to our Pueblo Museum to both learn about the projects that we were offering or that we were beginning to pilot at that space, but also to learn from the communities, maybe what the issues were in their communities, but then how we might be able to combine efforts to address some of those things. So through those conversations, we felt some synergy kind of emerge based on the goals of both their organizations and their communities and ours as well. And so one of our first partnerships out of that conversation was this particular project, again, in Antonito. And when we proposed the project, again, based on what we heard from the community, these are some of the proposed outcomes. We felt like launching this project could foster positive self-identity among the youth, because one of the things that we heard from the community is that the youth were being most impacted by these issues of health inequity within the community. We also heard very strongly an interest in building community connections and community cohesion. That became a proposed outcome. Of course, empowering youth as change agents, and then honoring and celebrating local history and culture. One of the things that we heard from a variety of communities is there was a concern among, again, many of our partner communities that some of the youth in our partner communities were feeling less connected to their community, or maybe not feeling as connected to the traditional history and culture and heritage that had been passed down from generation. And so we had elders in the community say, how can we re-engage youth in some of these histories and traditions so that they feel more connected, not just to the community, but also more grounded with their own identity and history and heritage. And we felt like Museum of Memory, through some of the early findings in initial projects, could maybe begin to address some of those concerns. So we launched this particular project in January of 2020, before any of us knew what COVID meant, or that was even going to be a thing. And so we launched in January. Initially when we proposed the project, the school in Antonito, which is South Conejo School District, or Antonito High School, wasn't a formal partner. We knew that we were going to be working with the school to recruit students into the project, but they weren't a formal partner in the beginning. But as we started, really almost early on, and I'm sure Lori can talk about this, almost immediately as we engaged with the school, engaged with the principal and a few of the teachers there, inquired about recruiting students into the project, they immediately said, how can we be even more involved? And so we actually, again, fairly quickly pivoted to what was going to be a project that was going to take place out of the school, probably on weekends or evenings, and actually were able to integrate the project into the school. We had a teacher that volunteered to collaborate with her. She happened to be the film production instructor in the high school, and she said, hey, we would love to have you, come in and participate, maybe, partner in our class, where if you're willing to come in as guest speakers into the class, maybe we could, allow you to have a an audience, because we were in, like I said, in the midst of that recruitment process, but then also like it would fulfill some of the goals that she had envisioned for that particular class. So in January we launched, we started working in the school in a film production class. Alejandra and I, who you'll hear from in a minute, went in to the school along with Lori once a week to begin, and started the process of some of this collective remembering. First, starting with talking about, what is the process of history? How is oral history maybe different than the traditional history that students were learning about in their social studies or, history class? How could we utilize the knowledge of elders in the community to really think about the place that we live and the impact that that has made, on our lives? And so beginning that process, of course, in March, we all were impacted by COVID. And so we had to shift. And so that meant a few things for us. Unfortunately, one of the things that the school decided was that they were only going to move forward for the rest of the academic year with core classes. All elective classes would be dropped at that point in time. Well, the video class was an elective class. So the class requirement was dropped. We worked with the students and with the teacher, because even though the class was dropped as a requirement, the school was still interested in partnering and finding a way to continue the project. They were invested in seeing its success. So we worked with the teacher, brainstormed with the students, and ended up shifting from the class format to an internship format. We came up with a small stipend to keep the students engaged, because one of the things that we learned too when this was all happening is that some of the students took on new responsibilities in the home. As I'm sure many of you are aware of, have heard, in particular in a community like Antonito, which is really a family-centered community. Some of the students, particularly our high school students, began taking on the role of maybe caregiver for younger students who now found themselves, without a school to go to. We had one young lady that was pulled into the family business. I think the family business had to lay off some employees, and so then she had to pick up hours and disconnect from the project. And so we did lose some students that were in the class originally. They weren't able to follow through the entire project with us. We were able to keep some as well, and the students that we did keep, we were able to meet with them virtually. They conducted the oral histories virtually in many cases. Some did personal interviews because of close connections with families and other members. But, we had to shift that. One of the really cool things that we did was that we had been planning a poetry workshop where we were going to bring in some poets that we had worked with to come in and work with the students around like writing their story and the connection to, the community, through their eyes. We had to shift that to a virtual format, and you'll see photos right here. So Manny Gonzalez and Jessica Helen Lopez were the two the two poets that we worked with. They taught that virtually. And one of the really neat outcomes of that is the students enjoyed that so much that they said, hey, could we offer this same workshop to community members? So we approached the poets about that. They said, yeah, we would love to do that. And we ended up hosting another session where we could have community come in and go through the same process that our students did. One of the unintended outcomes of that is that while initially in the plan for Museum of Memory would have been, these memory workshops with local community members, when we moved to a virtual environment, we were able to get participation from individuals who maybe grew up in Antonito or around Antonito, or maybe didn't grow up there. Maybe their parents did or their grandparents did, but they had this historic connection to the community. They participated as well from all throughout the state. So that was really kind of a neat outcome, and it really expanded the network for us, but also the learning for the students and for the community. And so with that, I'm going to share one of the pieces that was an outcome of the project, and then I'm going to stop. I feel like I've been going on probably longer than my allotted time, but we'll stop, pass it along. But before we do that, like I said, I'd like you to hear Kylie's piece. And if there's interest later in Chanel's, we can come back to that as well. So.
I'm from books, from food and fights. I'm from the greenhouse on 11th Street, where smells of cooking are always in the air. I am from the sunflower, the lilac bush whose long gone limbs I remember as if they are my own. I'm from the Conejos River and fishing for trout. From grandma and mom. I'm from unconditional love and sitting at the table during dinner and from laughing. I'm from get away and make me a PB&J and the apple don't fall too far from the tree. I'm from birthday parties. I'm from Mogote and Grandpa Roach. Pitas and green chili, from my auntie's fighting, from my auntie's death. Pictures of all the grandchildren on my grandma's wall. My secret box which holds all my loves. The secrets which cloud my mind but are never spoken out loud.
And so I just love every time I hear both Kylie's piece and Chanel's and all of the work that our students created. It just makes me happy. So hopefully you enjoyed that as well. And like so, we can dig in and talk a little bit more about how that may have connected to the rest of the project. But Julie, I'll pass it back to you.
Awesome, thanks, Eric. It's so wonderful to see some of the actual products of this project, and I'm sure one of the things we can talk about is how COVID impacted and perhaps strengthened some of those connections. But now I'm curious to hear a little bit from Lori. We've heard from Eric and Maria with the perspective of History Colorado's involvement in the project. And I'd love to get your perspective, Lori, on sort of why Antonito Together felt this partnership was beneficial, how you got involved, and to tell us a little bit about why it's important to use this partnership for your work.
Well, first of all, thank you. I'm happy to be here today. And I wanted to tell everybody a little bit about our group. And Antonito Together is a nonprofit health equity community outreach organization located in Antonito, Colorado. And we're a team of local volunteers as well as a few staff members who are committed to the mission of bringing health equity to our community. And basically, we've chosen two areas after a lot of work and planning to work on, and that's the cultural cohesion and involvement, as well as economic development. And for us, health equity means supporting opportunities that allow individuals and families in our community to have equal opportunities to achieve good health. And there are several ways to do that, but some that have been most important to us are building right now those strong social support networks and a strong connection to culture and heritage for our especially for our young people, our youth and young people, young adults. So the way that we chose to pursue this project, or how we decided to do this, is that as Eric mentioned, our team visited actually the Museum of Memory project in Pueblo, and so that's where they first learned about it. So as our team had been growing and developing, they went through a long period of strategic research and planning. And so from that work, our vision was formed for our organization, and we wanted our community, and especially our younger generations, to be able to reclaim their power to address and resolve the past, present, and future educational and cultural and economic issues in the community. We saw the Museum of Memory Project as one solution to helping our youth connect more deeply with their cultures. In Antonito, we have a very, very strong and predominantly Hispanic and what we would call Indio-Hispanic, because there's that connection. We have such a strong connection with the Native American population. So as the Spanish moved from Mexico into New Mexico, and actually our area was at one time a part of New Mexico, but we have that connection with both the Hispanic and the Native American cultures, both Pueblo, Native Pueblo communities, as well as other Ute and Apache and other types of communities or in the surrounding areas. So by sharing their own life experiences, which is something they were able to do throughout this, they talked, as was mentioned earlier, they talked about things such as their their home, their home, the one that really means home to them, that house that really means home. So they spent some time doing that. But they also looked at their experiences and chose to, especially after COVID occurred, talk about, COVID was a big thing on their minds. So they wanted to talk about not only what COVID was like now, but what was it like? What might it have been like in the past to if some of the elders had gone through the similar situation? And so their connection with the elders in the communities, we actually believe that this creates a stronger community and makes them stronger community members who are proud of themselves, their heritage, and of course their home. And so why it's important to our community is that Antonito and its surrounding villages had once been really vibrant Hispanic communities with deep-seated cultural norms and a really strong heritage of working together to deal with racial discrimination and oppression. So, from the time of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, when settlers began moving from what is northern New Mexico into our area in southern Colorado, they really had, at first it was very difficult because they didn't speak the language, they didn't understand the social structure, the governmental structures, things like that. So a lot of times people say, we didn't come to America, America came to us. So it was really kind of hard for them at first, but as they began working within the American system of life, they started really building those, started pulling together to really build those structures to protect themselves and help deal with some of the oppression and discrimination. But as the Antonito Together resident team began to explore present issues in the community, it was clear that this past of having the strong heritage of working together to deal with racial issues was no longer really the case. It didn't seem like our younger generations really were having that cohesiveness in the community, and even a lot of our elders in the community had begun to pull apart. So some of the things like the Spanish language, which in our area, we actually have a unique dialect that's really specific to northern New Mexico and southern Colorado. And it's kind of that old Spanish, very much like you would, if you were to look at the old English that that still occurred in the Appalachian area. It was similar here to the Spanish language that's still very unique and very much the original Spanish that was taking place in the 1600s when the Spanish first arrived. Excuse me. And so that was no longer being spoken, nor was any Spanish by the younger generations or many of the younger generation. And so traditions were also not being observed very much. A lot of the traditions that had been so strong, and if they were observed, they weren't really understood. So people didn't understand why you would do this any longer. And then cultural recipes were not being passed down. So really our youth and our young adults were not having that strong sense of connection to their culture, which makes a person feel proud and excited about their culture and about who they are and how special they are. So we felt that reconnecting our youth and young adults to their heritage helps them to build self-confidence and pride in who they are and where they come from. So for us, ultimately, through this, as well as our economic development work, we hope that our young people will choose to stay in our community, or at least return and build their own families and have healthy, happy, successful lives here. So we're working to do that. And we, as I said, some of our members visited the Pueblo Museum project, and they they really came back with a sense that this was a wonderful program of museum and memory. And they wondered how this might work or how it might be incorporated into our community where the stories of history and culture were being lost as the elders of the community were passing on. And it really seemed like there was no place where the stories, the pictures, artifacts, etc., were being safely preserved. And I say safely because a lot of what happened here is that people from the outside would come to the community and be excited about learning about the stories and so forth, but then they would take and create their own interpretations of things and maybe take pictures and things like that that were never returned to the community. So there was really no safe place for preservation for future generations. So because our focus on reconnecting youth and young adults to their heritage, we wondered if the Museum of Memory Project might be pursued. And Eric has already kind of talked about how all of that came to be. But I know another important piece was, and it's important in the community, people like to know people. It's important to know people and to feel comfortable with them. So Eric he had once been a guidance counselor at our school for a period of time. And so lots of our team members, or several of our team members and our school staff knew him and knew of him. And so it seemed like a great opportunity to pursue the partnership. So, you know, as Eric mentioned, talked about the video production class and having the opportunity to really connect further with the school, that really was it seemed to me like that really sealed the deal. This was our chance. You know, it's much harder to bring kids together in the afternoons or in the evenings or on weekends and so forth, but really having this group of students to start with was the key and important thing. So like Eric, I'm feeling like I'm going on too long probably, so better stop right there.
Awesome, thanks, Lori. I'm sure we'll dig into some more of that too. But for now, you mentioned a lot about you know, why this was important for your community from the kind of health equity aspect. And I'm wondering if Alejandra, you could talk a little bit about, from your perspective and from your role at History Colorado, how you were able to kind of implement that working with youth. You know, as a museum educator, what were some of the challenges of working with youth, and maybe what were some ways that it was easier, kind of a good fit?
Yeah, as Eric and Lori have mentioned, that we did start in a very school setting, classroom setting, which really allowed the project in the beginning to really flourish. So that's what made the beginning process of the project and how we were able to make so much progress in our training. So the youth during this time in the beginning stages of the Youth Memory Project, they're going through oral history training. They're learning what it is, what it means, and what it takes to just be an oral historian. So they're going through all of this training. So the classroom setting made it very easy for us to keep track of their progress, of what they're doing. Also, having an extra teacher in that setting created more accountability for the students throughout the week. So we were able to stay on track that way, which made it very easy. And as we mentioned, we started, COVID hit and they weren't really required. So which made it a challenge, making our youth team really dwindle from 10 to 2 to 3 students that once we were really into the project. Not only that, we no longer had that classroom setting that really held them accountable. So, and then including all our lives at this time were all centered in our home, in our living rooms, on our computer, which really made it hard for them to separate their home lives, their school lives, and then their internship life with us, which really made time management for them really difficult. So there's times throughout the project where I was getting emails or text messages at 1 a.m. from them trying to figure something out or had a question of the project. Or I would get them on the weekend where I'm trying to decompress and stay away from my phone and stay away from the internet in total. So that was probably a challenge. And then I think this is a challenge for every museum memory project, is that not every museum memory project flourishes the same way. All the training portion is the same, so that we can follow very closely, very similarly throughout every project. So if you were to reflect from our adult community ones compared to our youth, they follow the same timeline. But then when we start collecting oral histories, that's where it gets a little iffy. So with our youth, with their personal lives, I would have to sit in some of those interviews or help them set up those interviews. And then from there, switching that mentality of collecting and training to now, okay, what does it mean, or how do we get to the share back for our community? So that's the process where it gets a little challenging. And in all honesty, since this was our first youth memory project, we didn't really have much of a structure. So there was at times I remember where I was just winging it the best I could. Luckily, the youth were very, very helpful in this and made sure that since they had knowledge of a video production class, following kind of their lead kind of gave me a guidance too, which made it kind of easier for me to like guide them through and knowing the expectations of the community of what Lori's team wanted, and also knowing the expectations that what we wanted, and also meeting their needs. So that was probably one of the bigger challenges. And so yeah, throwing it back to you, Julie.
Yeah, thanks, Alejandra. So I have a few more questions for our panelists, but again, those of you who are listening in, please feel free to enter any questions you might have in the chat, either directly in Zoom or on FeedLoop. We're happy to take those questions and kind of dig into this conversation further. So one thing that I've been curious as you are all talking, it seems like there was a really natural collaboration among History Colorado, Antonito Together, and just sort of the community that you all are a part of, both as those organizations, but as individuals. And I'm curious if, and I'll kind of let whoever wants to answer this, but many of the public historians on this call will be familiar with the concept of shared authority, where museums sort of step back from the expert stance and let everyone involved in a project, particularly oral history, sort of speak to their own expertise. And it seems to me that this project really does that, but it also kind of takes a step further in sort of a shared stewardship. Lori was mentioning the stories and artifacts that were, not saved properly, or, the ownership was kind of taken from the community and put, on outsiders. And it sounds like this project sort of takes that idea on its head and really focuses on letting the community drive both the memory collection process, but also the preservation process. So I know Maria and I have sort of talked a little bit about this before, so maybe I'll let you kind of take a first stab, but I'm curious what other folks have to say too.
Yeah, of course. And I'm glad, Julie, that you're bringing these kind of like very important, but I would say also confusing terms, right? And what is the distinction between talking about the creation of opportunities for inviting in the community into the understanding of the creation of historical records with the study of the shared authorships, but also what does it mean to create the spaces to actually enable that process in a very productive way. So for something, one of the biggest lessons that we've had doing these projects is this process of kind of like seeing our role as authorities in the process of history recollection, of storytelling, in the process of recording history, and really letting the community members to weigh in as the experts of their own needs as the experts of their own perceptions of local aspects, and most important, as the ones that they know the motivations for why these histories should be collected and should be preserved. And I think Laurie just gave us a wonderful overview of what are the motivations of the community. Why the preservations of these oral histories, photos, or artifacts are so important and meaningful for them. So it's not necessarily the value of an object per se, but it's really about the voice of the community leading the importance and the assessment of the value of an object of oral history here. And what happens with this intentional practice of actually creating this space and practices for the community to share their points of view is that we're actually opening up the possibility of learning from them about their own practices, about their own processes for telling, describing, and preserving this collective past. So on the one end is inviting in community members to do this work in this co-authorship, but on the other end is actually being open for learning from them how to render something valuable. And an example that I can talk about this process, moving towards access and preservation, for example, is a process that we are piloting right now with some of the resident team members, which is the engaging them and involving them in the process of creating the mechanisms for access of these oral histories, and particularly in the context of indexing these oral histories. We don't do transcribing in History Colorado, but it's really the indexing. So traditionally, this indexing could be done for volunteers, but what we are learning is that the indexing process is a process that also provides and extends the voice of the community in the decisions of how these oral histories are interpreted and how these oral histories are going to be presented in the archive. So as I mentioned, right now we've conducted a couple of training and indexing conversations with a couple of team members from the resident team, in which they are the ones that are now going over the oral histories that were collected by the youth, and they are the ones that are creating these time-stamped thematic maps of the oral histories. And in one of the conversations that we had very recently, I think it was, Laurie, perhaps a couple of weeks ago, time flies with COVID, I don't even know which week we are right now. It was this very interesting conversation about the awareness that because those that are conducting, the wonderful volunteer team members that are doing the indexing are part of the communities. They are actually able to identify the relevance of events that perhaps for an outsider might not be that relevant for the community and for the culture. And in this case, it was the case of the harvest of lettuce or of lechuga. The idea that for other people, it might just be a more economic activities, whereas for the community, it has a much more important cultural value and a much important center of their identity of the cultural history. And I can talk about more examples, but perhaps someone else might want to jump in as well.
Well, I think that is very important. And I know that the folks involved in the indexing are pretty excited. You know, it's hard. They're realizing it's hard. It's not all that easy to do the process, but they are enjoying it. And one of the things that I think has come out of all of this is as we develop and one of our final goals, the goal for this particular project for which would have been 2020, and you know, with COVID, everything's taking so much longer to achieve. But I think that, you know, the more we do, and I had to look for pictures, and it was like pulling teeth to try to get people to even look through their pictures, but we showed a piece of the video, and then suddenly people were more interested in, and they're like, I have pictures. And then for the video, we recently engaged with some local musicians to add music to the video, and that engaged them even further. And now we're getting more pictures, more video, more opportunities. And with the indexing, the same thing happened. Oh, well, I have things that I can contribute. So I think that, you know, even though it's been hard, this process has been hard, and it started out with the youth. It's like the youth gained so much, but now we're also engaging the rest of the community through little pieces, little bits at a time. The more we give them and share with them, the more people are engaging in the process, and we look forward to continuing on next year in, further developing this program. So I think it's really exciting.
So another thing I want to ask about, I saw Abby has a question in the chat, and I would like to get to that. But before we do, I want to just elaborate a little bit on this idea of the intergenerational storytelling. So both Lori and Alejandra talked about how this project really focused on the youth, and that there was maybe a perception that the youth weren't interested in in their cultural heritage. And I know Alejandra and I have talked a little bit about this. And so I'm wondering if, Alejandra, you want to speak to that, and then if Lori or anyone else on the project can speak to if there were any surprising benefits of that kind of intergenerational conversation.
Yeah. So as Lori and Eric have mentioned, that the community felt like there was this like disconnect from their youth, or that the elders had this belief that the youth weren't really engaged in their community or didn't feel like a sense of belonging or a sense of identity. When we were in the recruiting process, just to get to know the youth and also understand if this perspective was real, I do 100% believe that the elders felt this way. So I just wanted to take a census of where the youth were at mentally. So we played a game, it's called This or That. You stand in the center of the classroom, and then you ask them a question and you give them two options. And on either side, they'll go stand on either side that they believed. I asked them if they felt proud or a sense of belonging in their community. And one side of the room was yes, and then the other side was no. And to my surprise and Lori's surprise and the whole team's surprise was that majority of them did feel a sense of proudness and a sense of identity within their community. And I think that was really important and a turning point in the project for Lori and the community team. And I think it really brought out a good, what's the word I'm looking for? It just brought out this sense of like belonging for them and wanting to do so well, and felt this sense of pride in their work. So anything that they had submitted, it was always filled with pride of and what they wanted to share about their community. And a cool thing about my job was not only to be the middleman for like the whole project, but it was also trying to create the sense of healing and this bridging these gaps from the belief of what the elders thought, and knowing that the youth felt this pride for their community was now within this project. They can show that the youth just needed to be engaged in a different way. So I think that's what this project really brought out in them. I don't know if Lori had anything to add.
I did. I was actually so impressed with that activity, and it felt so good to see that. It was so great to take that back to our team, to be able to say, guess what? Our youth actually love their community. They love the community. We just need to let them take the lead sometime on telling us what they care about. So I think it really taught our group, who were all adults at the time, and now we actually have a youth advisory council, is a part of our organization. But it allowed us to learn that our youth care about our community and the things they don't like about it. It also gave us an opportunity to figure out, how do we address some of those things? How do we go about addressing some of the things that they're not happy about or that they would like to change? And so I thought that was an important, and a second piece of that I thought was important too, was that I think a lot of times when we try to bring a group of kids together and a group of adults together or elders together, it's really hard. Everybody feels a little shy about that. And especially we've noticed this using Zoom. Most of our kids, when we do Zoom activities, all we see is their forehead, you know, because they're a little shy about doing things. But when you do things one-on-one and listening to our oral history interviews, you could tell that everybody was engaged. You know, the students were interested in what they were hearing, and they were excited, you know, and they were learning things. And so maybe more of the one-on-one is important when it comes to introducing or bringing people together to be able to talk to an individual versus try to deal with an entire group when you're already nervous about that. So I thought that was really special, and it was fun hearing them be surprised when an elder said something and be excited, and for the elder to be like, yeah, this is what happened. And so it was pretty great. Thank you.
I just want to add one thing, Julie, as well. It makes me think of, while there, in some ways, I think existed this disconnect or misunderstanding between our youth and elders. I think, Lori mentioned earlier, I had a chance to spend, close to a year working closely with the school district there before this project. And one of the things that I really noticed in building relationships with the youth, and this isn't, I don't think, uncommon in communities that maybe are facing issues of, historic oppression and injustice, is oftentimes there was this weight that some of our students were carrying around, being defined by outsiders and having this, perceptions that often, unfortunately, are deficit-based. There are challenges that exist in some of our communities throughout the San Luis Valley, issues of poverty and health inequity and some of these things. And I think for some of our youth that, that's a burden that they carry. And so I think in some ways this activity, but then also this project, is really, I think, provides opportunity for students to reclaim that history and really begin thinking about their community and their families and their elders and their neighbors and themselves in more an asset-based framework, and discover issues of resiliency and power and community. Some of these things that Lori talked about that really have been the hallmarks of survival for many of our communities here in the area. I think reconnecting, and in some crazy way, COVID, I think, helped shine a spotlight on that, because as I think it was Lori that mentioned that the students became, or Alejandra mentioned that the students were interested in exploring, how would our elders have navigated COVID times when they were older, or when their parents or grandparents were older. And I think these stories of the challenges that parents and grandparents and elders faced, and how they navigated those collectively, I think was really powerful for some of our students. So anyway, I just wanted to share that piece.
That's really powerful, Eric. It's making me think, we always say that we don't want history to repeat itself, but in this project, you're sort of drawing upon the resilience of the past and showing that, the resilience of the community's ancestors is something that you do want to draw forward into the future. And I think that is, a power of the Antonito Youth Memory Project, but also the Museum of Memory Projects in general, really drawing on a community's history to build it better for the future. So I think that's really, really powerful. So at this point, I do want to address, Abby had a question in the chat, and I do kind of want to close out our questions for the panelists with sort of tying this question, which Abby has, which is, how do you balance your work with Museum of Memory with your other work? Abby says, there are several other communities that are interested in doing something similar to this, but my primary work is as an event planner, and I'm struggling to balance my main work with these other projects. And I'm wondering if you have any words of wisdom. So with that specific question, I'd also like to ask if there's anything that you all have taken from this project and that you plan to incorporate in future Museum of Memory projects, or that might be good advice for folks like Abby who are doing similar community-based projects on their own.
I can begin answering the question from the perspective of someone overseeing the initiative across different museums. And also from the perspective of someone who has kind of like plays this role of the liaison between the teams that are working directly with the communities at the larger priorities and processes of History Colorado archives, and which include curatorial services and collection access staff, etc. So one of the, and perhaps this also gives a little bit of the answer to the question that we had in the chat. How do you balance that? This has to be very intentional work, intentional both in terms of like really authentically connected with communities to do this work, but also intentional work in making sure that there are the processes in place, the systems in place, the tools and mechanisms in place at the level of the organization to be able to support this kind of work. And when I say that, I mean being able to locate the points of alignment between the organization, the points of alignment between the organizations and the community organizations that we're working with, but also in our case, the points of alignment between the practices that community museums have, the practices that History Colorado Center have, and this is just to give a more background. I mean, History Colorado Center is kind of like the big ship, and we have like the other community museums that are independent in as much as like they do their practice, but they are connected, and their work also filters to the work that we have in History Colorado Center, which our permanent archives are located. So for example, talking about this alignment, we are collaborating very closely with our colleagues from collection access and curatorial services. And they have very specific and unique requirements in terms of like what is needed for the oral histories, the materials, the objects, the artifacts, the photos that are being collected through these grassroots efforts, so they can actually be included in permanent collection. So it has really been a very thorough process of aligning the needs of the permanent collection with the needs of the community, with the needs of Museum of Memory, aligning protocols. So we know, for example, right now that we need to have like very specific consent forms, and to be able to have conversations with the community about what does it mean to talk about consent forms, and to make sure that we have like a workflow that really facilitates the processes and the interactions among all the multiple stakeholders that are involved in these projects. So the projects can go from achieve the goal that Lori was talking about, this possibility of having a safe space for preserving and interpreting and honoring and amplifying the voices of the community.
I also wanted to add, because I wasn't sure about Abby's question, if it was related to, based on museums, or if it was related to communities trying to do this work. And if it was related, as a community organization, I can speak to that, and how do we do all these different projects and so forth. And I have to say, in our organization, it was hard at first, because we had one full-time coordinator who took care of all the work with the team and so forth, and organization and all the accounting and etc., those sorts of things. And then we started with me as a half-time community organizer, and I had both the economic development as well as the cultural cohesion and involvement projects. So that is a little challenging, but what we did, the team was engaged in coming up with plans. And one of the plans that we felt we had to do in order to make all this work was to engage with experts on this and organizations that could help make this work come to fruition. So that's why we engaged with History Colorado and the Fort Garland Museum, is that we knew that they would have the skills, the resources, the background, and so forth to do this type of work, because that's what they do as an organization anyway. And so it was really important to bring them together, and for me, as to be able to support, but not to have to create everything and try to figure everything out for myself, which would have been virtually impossible. But by engaging other groups and determining who those groups or individuals are, it really does does help to be able to have multiple things going on at one time. And so, yeah, that's how we have to do it. And we've since been able to hire a couple of other organizers to help with different aspects of our work. So I hope that helps to answer that question.
Abby said in the chat that it was helpful. So we have another question from Emma, who says, I currently work in a regional planning agency where I've been working to integrate public history methods and approaches into our community engagement processes and planning priorities. Did this project or other projects facilitated through the Museum of Memory initiative result in collaborations with local and/or state government partners? If so, what was that experience like? So I'll maybe toss that to Maria. I will also note that History Colorado is actually a state agency. So we have a little bit of that experience that you're talking about, Emma, but I'll let Maria speak a little bit more to that.
And I'm sure that like perhaps Eric can also add a little bit as well to this one. So for instance, an example that I can think of is the collaboration that we had with the Youth Memory Project in Bruce Randolph School, in which it was really a collaboration with our National Western Center partners. This includes the Colorado State University, that's also a huge important player in the redevelopment of this section of Denver that is connected, or is the place where this school is located. So one of the goals for that project was engaging again the youth in the decision-making process of what was happening in their communities in terms of development. So that's like a partnership that evolved in conversation with this institution of higher education, in conversation with other partners, and in conversation with the local school for the development of this youth program. What is really interesting there is that this project actually served as a way for the youth to do like a needs assessment and a mapping of assets within the community, but also it was also a way to map and to identify those youth members that could actually be brought into a youth advisory board. So that's one of the examples. Another example that we are not kind of like even like far to say that we're in partnership with, but we've received interest from local government agencies that to engage in projects. That sounds very similar to your question, Emma. How can we engage these type of projects in much larger efforts to actually bring about awareness for tourism, for example, for the communities? How can we start thinking about doing this kind of work as a means to identify the assets so a community can embrace themselves as a destination in Colorado through telling authentic stories about themselves, so they can actually support themselves towards different paths for economic development. So as I said, we have not had that experience yet, but it is really interesting for us to start receiving attention from local government agencies that are interested in thinking about the possibilities for collaborating in this kind of work. Also, we've just trained a team from the Santa Fe Public Library in New Mexico to do this kind of youth memory works, because they are also partnering with their local government to develop a youth memory project that would really facilitate a lot of the goals for Youth Memory Project, which is like developing this intergenerational connection with community members, also with a vision for thinking about a better future for the community. But I'm not sure if there's any other examples that we can bring in, like Eric.
So the one example that comes to mind, and I didn't work specifically on this project, but this is probably a good time to just give a kudos to Don DePrince, who's our Chief Operating Officer at History Colorado now, but was the former director of the El Pueblo History Museum. And part of the way that this program originated was under her leadership, and it was through, I think, something that connects to this question. There was a proposed rerouting of an interstate or a highway in Pueblo, which is the community that we're talking about, that was set to be, constructed. And the story, I think, goes that they had planned like the demolition of like 69 homes in a neighborhood, a historic neighborhood in Pueblo, as a result of this reroute of this highway. And so while this research was being done, I think, I don't know if it was the city or local municipalities came to the museum and said, hey, we'd like to gather some information around, you know, the history of this neighborhood and these homes, and really do a preservation type of assessment. And so, you know, Don took on this project, but decided to bring in, beyond just looking at the preservation of the physical structures themselves, gathered community, pulled together some early, what we would now call memory workshops, to really talk about some of the history and the memories. And through this process, actually, the community members, this wasn't, I don't think she went into the project intending this, but one of the really beautiful outcomes of this conversation was that residents became really strong advocates and activists, if you will, for the preservation of their community and their home. And I think still to this day, I think that project took place like something like 6 or 7 years ago. That project has never happened, largely because the voice of the community. And so I think through that experience, you know, Don realized that, okay, there's some real power, not just in, you know, individual oral history, but this collective oral history, and some of the ways in which it can create, you know, community and activism and connection and, you know, all of those things, you know, within a community. And we've seen that play out in a lot of different ways. We haven't here out of our museum worked specifically with local governments, but I think, you know, we can't, because of the nature of all of our communities, you know, like in Antonito and in San Luis, I don't think our projects would be successful without the support of, you know, local municipalities and governments. I mean, they're small communities. And so, you know, what the work that we do, you know, really impacts and is impacted by, you know, everyone else in the local ecosystem, if you will. So.
And I can just add one small thing from our organization as well, is that we're really starting, and I think this helped that I was the organizer for both economic development and cultural cohesion, but it really helped to look at the idea as we're building on helping our students with careers and you know, future careers and so forth, that we're able to also look at what are some of the cultural activities that could create you know, future businesses, future entrepreneurship opportunities for our young people to not only stay in their community, but build on their culture. And whether that's in tourism, as Maria had mentioned, be able to, you know, bring people, because a lot of people, like if you think of Santa Fe, New Mexico, well, we have in many ways, we have a lot of that culture. And there are other small communities in northern New Mexico that bring people to their area simply by the cultural assets that are in that community. So being able to work together with our local communities, our local governments, to be able to develop through, you know, or use economic development as a tool to build those, to build on our culture, to be able to share with others who might want to come here or might want to, you know, even if it's something online where a student wants to build an online business, but people are saying, hey, you know, I love green chili, I love tortillas, I love those kind of things that come from those states where I've either visited or I used to live in or whatever, and be able to share that, you know, throughout the world potentially.
Well, thanks all. We have about 15 minutes left. I encourage folks, if you have other questions, again, please drop them in either the chat, or at this point, if you'd like to unmute and or turn your video on, you're welcome to do that to ask questions of our panelists. Or if there's anything else, Eric, Maria, Alejandro, or Lori, you would like to say, feel free to jump in.
So I guess a couple of things. I saw the question in the chat about the like outcomes and how the material is being shared, and maybe Maria can share more about this, because this is really you know, community focused. A lot of that ends up, even a lot of the ways that this is shared is really you know, in the hands of the community. But I know there are several different examples. So one of the projects, I think it was in the Salt Creek neighborhood project in Pueblo, where you saw the beautiful mural that Maria showed. They created a SoundCloud channel or station to be able to share some of those oral histories publicly to kind of a really broad audience. You know, we're working right now on putting the final touches on a video or documentary style video that will be the culminating project of the Antonito Memory Project. And of course, all of these ways are intended to share both within the community and to external audiences. But then the work that Maria and in this case, Lori are doing for this project, I think really help preserve the histories, in particular the stories, for future generations, for future community members, future researchers, future, you know, we're actually, one of the things that we're also working on at our museum is a curriculum project with another community, you know, similar to Antonito. I mentioned San Luis a few times. They're not too far from us, but we're in partnership with the school to develop or reimagine the fourth grade curriculum. In Colorado, fourth grade is where Colorado history is taught. So we're working with the school to reimagine that curriculum and think about how we can really localize, you know, that Colorado history curriculum to pull in some of the local history and culture and assets of the community. And what we're thinking about is already these oral histories that have been collected by, you know, by Lori's team and by the team that we're working with in San Luis, maybe, you know, really great assets that we can roll into, you know, the curriculum. So there's a lot of ways that I think that we envision using this work. We don't, you know, we don't want them sitting on a shelf collecting dust somewhere, you know, if at all possible. So Maria, Lori, I don't know if you have other thoughts about that.
I mean, that's great. And Eric, I'm so glad that you're mentioning this, because it actually brings another central element to the work that we're doing and that we keep as at the forefront of the work that we do, which is this notion of reciprocity. This understanding that is not only that we are collaborating and that we are not only learning with the community about their past, but also we are enabling the community for also to learn from the products and the projects that Museum of Memory has. So, and as you mentioned, we have like two different ways that this is happening right now within the community with this process of the developing of the share bags. And these share bags, you already mentioned, they in some cases and most of the times they have relied on using the arts. So we have a mural that was interpreted from oral histories in Salt Creek with the Bruce Randolph Youth Memory Project. The youth actually created what it's called blackout poetry out of the oral histories, and they reinterpreted those texts, those transcriptions of the oral histories into poems that were presented later on to the community. And in that process, the event, there was intergenerational conversation. In other parts, this shareback looks like an exhibit that is guided by the community, advising what is going to be exhibited and how is it going to be exhibited. And but it's also thinking what Eric was mentioning beyond the community, and how do we make sure that all these oral histories are used. And I'm so grateful, Eric, that you are mentioning the projects, developing the curriculum and using these oral histories, which at the end is one of the final goals of this oral history, of these Museum of Memory projects. How can these stories be amplified, used, and can be embraced by future generations and communities? And I would be super interested, actually, since we have Lori here and Alejandra here, who have been collaborating in this idea, in this shareback, just to talk about how this sharing is looking right now for the Antonito Memory Project, particularly with the video production, Lori, and why a video was the right choice here.
Well, I think, of course, one of the things was just a logistical thing that worked out so well, was to be able to do that with the video production class. But I think, you know, the idea of being able to bring together portions of those oral histories with the students asking the questions and hearing the answers from the people that they've worked with, that's been really important. And as I mentioned before, bringing in the music now, the local folk music of the community as another layer that creates more texture to that video. Also the poetry aspect of that, and the pictures that we've been able to bring in a lot more pictures. Like I said, the more we show it things, the more people are engaging with that, which is really important. And also I think when thinking about the oral histories, one of the students decided to interview a young person in the community as well. So it wasn't just the elders. They wanted to get the perception of a younger person, a young adult in the community, and they did that. But what was really interesting is that young adult really brought back some of the interesting stories, some of the the methods that her grandparents and grandparents in the past had used, some of those stories that help us to remember we need to get home before dark, because there are things out there that we don't want to confront in the dark. And so, using that as a mechanism for obedience and so forth, or part of that obedience. But it was really fascinating that some of our elders in the community loved that, and I had heard from one member of the community, why are we interviewing young people? It's like, because they have stories too. They're able to talk about not only that, but how does this, why is my community important to me? Why does it matter to me? What is it that makes a community, a small community like ours, special? Being able to visit, go to the grocery store and have 8 conversations versus being in some strange place where nobody knows us and it's huge and so forth. So I think that's really important.
I would just like to add that, so not only our sharebacks look very different from each project, as Maria's mentioned, we have a mural, and as Lori mentioned with the Antonito Together project, we've produced a video. As we mentioned, San Luis also their shareback is looking a little different. We're probably in the works of a possible calendar, which they want to expand into like a community calendar. So these projects are not only staying in one dimension, they're also moving into multiple dimensions as where this idea of the shareback wanting to be a continuous thing throughout the community. And with the Antonito project, which I really enjoyed to see flourished, was that one of our students in particular found a loving and a calling for history. So for a while she was an intern for us, and now she is a part of the Antonito Together youth team now as a permanent person there. And she's also taken a lot of the lead in like wanting to be a part of this bridging that gap that we had mentioned earlier. So this project is not only just doing work for our youth, it's also doing a lot of work for the community of wanting to, and it's also finding a new way to preserve history in a form that like, oh, we're not preserving it in our traditional historical museum way. We're allowing it to grow and adapt, and we're wanting to share and follow that growth and adaptation with the museum memory projects.
Great, thanks. We have a couple of questions in the chat, and we only have about 5 or 6 minutes left, so I'm hoping we can kind of get to both of them. But I want to start with Kate's question from Feed Loop. She says, thank you all for undertaking such important work. I know that grants and funding agencies often ask for specific assessments and post-project statistics to prove its success. How do you do this when the work is more intangible community outcomes?
I'm gonna just jump quickly, and please say to me quickly, Maria. So we do have evaluation. We have ongoing evaluation, and the interesting part here is for us to understand that this is a community engaged process. Therefore, the evaluation methods are in alignment with the community-based approach. So we employ participatory evaluation, in which we are all in conversation at multiple moments during the project, in which we are learning about what are the outcomes that we are seeing. And these are not necessarily intangible outcomes, which is like the interesting question here, right? We are seeing, for instance, Alejandra just shared the example of one of the youth members, Kylie, who she like expressed the love of her to history, right? That we are seeing practices, we're seeing actual changes in the behavior of the youth by reaching out to connect with History Colorado in Fort Garland to actually be part of the volunteer team to be able to bring this project forward into the accessioning and preservation part of it. We are seeing, as Lori mentioned, the magic that happened when this production video in production was shared with musicians, and musicians are completely buying into the process. And it kind of like started much deeper conversations about community and about integration and about what these videos should be doing for the community. So the tricky part, I would say here, is just to be able, as you're writing grants, to be able to mention what is this project about, to be able to mention the essence of a community-based project, and to find the adequate ways to actually communicate these outcomes. Another strategy that we're using, for example, the youth, at least in the project in San Luis, because we're learning in every project, we're implementing like a diary process in which they are writing their experience working week by week. And that diary is one of the ways in which we are tracking changes in behaviors and understandings of themselves within the project, but also on themselves in relation to the community. So, and these conversations are going to happen with the youth at the end of the project, and you are going to be able to reflect back when they started, to reflect when they're ending. And to be honest, the challenge here is for us to see what is the long-term impact on these projects, and we're still trying to figure out. But that's why it's important to keep in touch with the community partners that you're working with, so we can together do this work in the long term.
Yeah, I'm curious, Lori, if you have anything to add from the perspective of the community organization.
Well, I think I agree with Maria, and what we're doing as we evaluate for each of our for our grants and so forth is really bringing those tangible things together, because we really are talking about the things we hear, the things we see in the community, you know, as we're engaging young people in a process that they may learn, that may create their own, you know, a future career for them, as we're building this video process that we've gone through from the oral histories, and people are engaging with each other, because one of our goals being, you know, that we create cohesion. So the more that we're bringing people together, and this whole process has brought people together in different ways, and we can talk about how many people participated when we shared the video, and we did share a piece of it a while back before it was completed, and how many people engaged in that, and what were the comments that we received through evaluation. So using those evaluation tools as well as a part of that. And so, and I know we're not quite complete with this, and we'll be sharing our completed video sometime in the near future. And again, we'll engage through evaluation and such that we can share back with our funders and be able to talk about what we're doing in that. So there are a lot of tangibles, and sometimes it's hard to see if you're just hearing about something, but when you're really engaged in it, you're going to find a lot of tangible things that you can share with the funders.
Well, thank you all so much for sharing about the Antonito Youth Memory Project. I hope our participants gained a lot from this conversation. I know I did. I always love chatting with my colleagues about projects that I don't get the chance to work on. So thank you all for attending and for all of your insightful questions. If anyone has questions about this project, feel free to reach out to me or Eric or Maria or Alejandra or any of us for if you have any questions through the conference platform. And as I shared I believe I shared in both the feed loop and the Zoom chat, you can take a look at the Museum of Memory Initiative website on the History Colorado website. And again, thank you all so much for letting us share this project with you, and enjoy the rest of NCPH. Thank you.
Julie, just real quickly, Julie, I know we're at time, but if I just saw a request for one more piece, I'd be happy to go out of the session, sharing one more student piece. It's about 40 seconds. So
I think that's a great idea, Eric. Let's do it.
I come from the Chicos in the fields, the lights of Las Vegas, to the wood Grandpa cut with his bare hands, the home Mom left and the home we're building. I come from the patience Vaya has taught me, to the fears my dad has given me. I come from knowing that the sunrise needs to be seen and the thunder needs to be heard. I come from Grandma's fresh chicken casserole. I come from Grandpa's COPD, knowing that every breath is a heaven sent. I come from the Lady of Guadalupe who buried my abuela. I come from the Lujans who have grown to Antonito.
that's it. Thank you.
Great way to close. Thanks, everyone. Have a good afternoon.